I would like to formally get us back started in the last sort of module, now that we're in the modular thinking kind of state of mind with platform conference of our conference. Slight change of format, which I'm sure you would find interesting. We are starting on our panel. And as you've stayed with us throughout the day, which I hope you would stay till the drink receptions coming up in this afternoon, a lot of the speakers have touched on the topic of platform regulation and privacy, deregulation. So this panel today, we are going to talk about that issue head on, and potentially the questions that you had and didn't have a chance to ask, we would either address now or through Q&A. We are, even though education, like many industries, is not the most innovative one, we are going to try to embrace the technology about which we speak. So we have set up a link for you to post your questions. I believe that we could project this link right here. So if you have devices, which I'm sure you do, you can go in and type your question as we are doing the discussion. And I have this little device here to see the questions, and hopefully we'll have a little bit of time at the end. We're running behind schedule, so we may only get to a few questions, but I'm sure we will try our best. So without further ado, I'd like to talk about and get us to dive into the topic. If you haven't been today in the room and just joining us, there has been a lot of discussion in the press about platform regulation. There has been discussion more broadly about regulation of technology businesses. US government and European governments are very active in that front. So today we put together a panel of academics and practitioners to talk about platform regulation and the views they have on it. And I'll just ask our speakers to introduce themselves briefly, and then we jump into the discussion. So if you want to get started.
Hi, I'm Greg Savinsky. I'm from Microsoft. I'm an assistant general counsel in the competition law group at Microsoft. I've been there for 18 years. I spend most of my days these days thinking about competition policy as it relates to platforms and platform regulation, both here and in Europe and worldwide, and mergers.
Hi, everybody. My name is Rob Siemens. I'm a professor here at NYU Stern in the management department. My research is primarily around technology and strategy. Competition policy is also something I think a bit about. And more recently, I've been doing some work on AI, looking at how AI and other types of automating technologies are affecting the economy in terms of economic growth, as well as effects on labor. In terms of teaching, I know that there's some students in the room, and so I hope to see you in some of my classes, either later this fall or next spring. Game theory, strategy, strategic management of AI. I look forward to seeing you all.
Thanks, Rob.
My name's JP Eggers. I'm also an associate professor in the management department. I'll be simple. I mostly do work focusing on innovation and strategy.
And I'm Chaim Fried. I actually spent a lot of years at both Google and Microsoft in engineering and product, but today I'm the CEO of a company called Owl, and we're an AI platform for video surveillance. We try to improve quality of life in large urban buildings, but we also have products for the elder care and healthcare space that improve people's well-being using biometric data and lots of other privacy sensitive data. And so the topics here today are very, very much things I focus on.
Great. Well, thank you. I'm very happy to have everybody here. And to get started, I wanted to start with you, Greg. So Microsoft is not a company that's new to regulation and regulatory pressures. Yet these pressures have now embraced a large number of what we called in this conference platform companies. I was wondering if you can tell us what's different. You know, you've experienced these pressures as a company since at least I started teaching at Stern in 2001 and before. So what's new?
Well, very big picture, I think what's new is the business models that are most critical in the economy today are very different. When I started at Microsoft, I came to work on both the DOJ and the European Commission cases against us. And the platform that was in issue was the Windows platform for desktop operating systems, and on the network side, it was Windows Server networks for running your IT infrastructure inside your business. There was no such thing as the cloud. Everything was local. You had your local area LAN. You had your IT person down the hall that you could call to come and set up your laptop, and you ran everything, or your workstation, and you ran everything locally, either on your desktop or on the server down the hall. That was a very different structure business than what we're seeing now in terms of online services. That corporate and enterprise infrastructure has moved to the cloud to a significant degree, and companies are increasingly moving to the cloud. But what's really changed is the advent of what I would call consumer online platforms. And from where I sit as a competition lawyer, you have to draw a very big distinction between the different kinds of business models. The true platform model of, say, a Windows or in the cloud and AWS is a model where you basically have a platform upon which others either build a business or run their business. And you don't control that relationship between your customers and their customers. What's happened in the consumer space is what Ben Thompson likes to call super aggregation. Whereas the pre-internet economy, the real issue for companies was distribution. How do I get my newspaper into the hands of the consumer? Today, in the consumer space, the problem is not distribution. Distribution on the internet is free. The problem is access to consumers. And a business model has developed around platforms where you basically have a group of platforms that have developed in what I would call three areas of particular interest to regulators, at least. Search advertising, social networks, the ad technology stack for monetizing those search engines and social networks, and marketplaces. And those are all platform businesses. Some more than others fit what I would call the super aggregator model, which is basically zero marginal cost, near zero price or zero price to consumers, and significant value accrual to the gateway keeper, the platform owner. In the case of, say, search advertising, for example, you know, if you advertise on Bing, you go through our search ad platform. If you advertise on Google, you go through the Google search ad platform. So we own that side of our business, and the other side of the business, which is customer acquisition, to come and use our search engine. So I would say that it's probably not an understatement to say that most regulators worldwide, when they say big tech, what they really mean are these very large consumer online platforms. Those are where the principal interest is, because these platforms have real economic power. And more importantly, there are negative externalities associated with these platforms that are not reached under traditional antitrust law principles. I'm sure you've read it. There's all kinds of commentary out there about, how can there be anything bad about something where it's free to the consumer, or Amazon is great because prices are so low. Well, there are negative externalities associated with that. And increasingly what we're seeing, and you have to push back on a little bit, there's a lot to regulate in this space, but antitrust law is not necessarily the panacea for all of these harms. For instance, content moderation, privacy, those kinds of things are really important and really call out for some kind of regulation. I think the competition space, it's a finer question about whether regulation is essential, or whether we need to change laws, or on the other end of the extreme would be to break up some of these companies. And I agree with Marshall that would be a bad idea for a lot of reasons. So is that a good enough brief intro onto where?
It's an excellent answer, and I'm wondering if others want to weigh in, because what I heard you say is that it's good to regulate some aspect of technology businesses, but perhaps not the competition aspect. Any reactions to that? where do we stand as a panel on this topic?
Let me just jump in on one thing, so Greg can confirm this. I wrote down when he said it, there's a lot to regulate, and it's I think it's sort of fascinating to sit on a panel with someone from Microsoft saying there's a lot to regulate.
Yeah.
Okay. That's why I wrote it down.
Yeah. Let me just be very clear on that, because there are aspects of this technology. Let's just briefly talk about AI. Facial recognition, it's clear that there needs to be a regulated approach here. And I think basically most of the large platforms that are offering AI services as a platform are vocally saying we need to have a common set of regulations and the government needs to help out here. This is not something that's ripe for self-regulation. Same with content moderation. Self-regulation is going to be hard. It's going to require a mix of industry and government working together to tackle these problems. On the competition side, for these negative externalities that aren't really reached under what we call the consumer welfare standard, there may be regulations that are necessary, but there may also just be new ways of approaching questions like non-price effects in mergers, burdens of proof, standards of proof, how do we measure innovation or loss of innovation in a merger, some creative thinking in those spaces. So you can call that regulation, I suppose. And then there may be those situations where it's a total market failure and regulation is appropriate. And the only solution is to basically create something like a mandatory data sharing scheme. And there are people out there who are advocating for that, and there are good reasons not to do that too. There are negative effects on incentives to invest. Why would I continue to invest millions and billions of dollars in some of these platforms if I have to basically share all my most proprietary data with a competitor? So these are real hard issues, and they're the issues that are on the table right now in this space. And the rules are going to be made in the next 4 or 5 years, I would predict, on how this is going to work going forward.
I must say you covered a lot of territory.
Sorry.
So I feel, so in my mind, what we hope to accomplish is to just parse within the categories that you introduced, because I think this is the bulk of what I think we need to talk about as a society and in this conference. So I was wondering if, given what you said, can we think about what are the regulatory options? And perhaps from what you said, maybe these options are different in different sort of competition settings. But I know, Rob, you have written about it, so maybe we get started with you on what are the regulatory options in this space.
Yes. Is Annabelle here? Oh, hey, Annabelle. So I don't yet have a book, right? So I can't promote a book. But I do have an article, and I would encourage everybody to take a look at my article on Forbes. It's called, what's it called? A Primer on Regulating Big Tech. And what I do in that article is try to lay out a few different options. I'm sorry? Oh, thank you, Annabelle. I like it too. So I try to lay out, or I try to describe sort of pros and cons of different options. And so I thought I would just sort of walk you, and some of you, of course, know these really well, but I thought I would just sort of walk folks through a few of the different options. This isn't meant to be all-encompassing, but these are ones that get talked about a lot. So at one end of the spectrum, there are folks that say, do nothing, right? And they tend to bring up examples like AOL and MySpace, and they say, those are examples of companies that were around and then were toppled, and so we should leave everything alone because we can see that in this tech space sometimes there is competition and incumbents get toppled over. At the way other end of the spectrum, there are policies that are being put forward, including by folks that are running for president, that big tech should be broken up. Now, one of the things that doesn't get talked about in great detail is the different ways to break up, sort of the different ways to break up a big tech platform. And the two sort of general things to keep in mind is you could have a horizontal breakup, so that would be taking Facebook and sort of breaking it in half. So there'd be sort of two Facebooks, it might be Instagram and Facebook. A separate way to think about, quote unquote, breaking up big tech would be more of a vertical breakup, where you would take, just for example, Google, and you would say Google can do search, but whatever Google also does that Google owns, it sort of rests on search, like Maps or something like that. All of that would need to be broken off and perhaps be in a different company. And so these two different approaches are ones where there are sort of different trade-offs associated with them. So I think of those as being sort of two ends of the spectrum. And then in the middle, there are other types of options. So an NYU professor who won the Nobel Prize in economics last year, Paul Romer, he has a proposal to tax digital advertising, for example. Another solution that some people talk about is some type of a specialized regulator or a special venue where if you have complaints about what a big tech company is doing, you can take those complaints to that specialized regulator. As a side note, in the UK, it looks like there'll be something like this that will happen. There is right now something called the Competition Markets Authority. They will probably have a digital markets regulator that's part of that. And there might be, you could imagine, some type of expedited forum where you could take your complaints. Data portability, that's something that Greg brought up that hopefully we'll talk about in more detail in a little bit. That would be another idea. The idea here is sort of similar to telephone number portability, right? So you all probably remember back in the olden days with telephones, you had your phone number that was associated to you. You're not this type of phone, but I guess like a house phone, right? And if you wanted to switch, if you wanted to switch to another provider, you had to get a brand new telephone number. And of course, there are these huge network effects that create these switching costs, so you wouldn't do that because you have to then update everybody that you know about the new phone number. So you'd stay with AT&T or whoever the incumbent was. In any case, so data portability is an idea that's sort of akin to telephone number portability. One final idea, and this is an idea from a professor at NYU Law named Catherine Stramberg, is sort of quote unquote use then delete. So the idea is you use an individual's data, right, for whatever it is that you're going to do, maybe your search engine or something like that, or some targeted advertising or something, but then the platform needs to delete it either immediately or maybe after a week or something like that. And the idea is that should reduce, to the extent that data is providing an advantage to some large tech companies, that should reduce actually the amount of data that they have, and so that might help, that might provide some benefits to new entrants that don't have as much data. I'll sort of pause there. In any case, there's sort of many different types of solutions to a problem. I guess one question is whether it's a problem or not. But regardless of that, there are sort of a variety of regulatory solutions.
Thanks, Rob. That was a nice, maybe not comprehensive, but certainly very thought-through list. And I was wondering, like, to turn from a big established company to a startup, Chaim, what are your thoughts about these types of regulation options, and what would it mean for a new business that's trying to get into and sort of commercialize data?
So, there's a lot there. So, trying to figure out where we start. So, data portability is obviously something that we would definitely appreciate and want to see. It definitely levels the playing field for startups. No question about that. In terms of when we think about breaking up large companies, that doesn't excite anybody in this space because everybody wants to be big someday, and the last thing they want to think is that, gee, that's going to, when you get there, we're going to break you up. And more importantly, I don't think it actually solves any problems. There are very few cases where I look at the large companies and say, well, gee, had I been on the other side of that one, that would have affected me. In terms of regulation or self-regulation, so again, I mentioned we do biometric data, and that was a sort of a really big pain point for us because we were actually in a space where it was uncharted territory, and we felt there needs to be regulation in this space. And there weren't very many people to talk to. And so we had our own set of rules that we put together and we shared with our customers, and we were really proud that we turned away lots of customers who couldn't comply. But ultimately, that kind of doesn't help when the shit hits the fan and the public begins to say, well, gee, what's going on with our data? That does little to help you. So I think Greg's definitely right. We all want to see, both large platforms and small companies like ours want to see government regulation, specifically around data transparency and privacy.
I was just going to, so it's interesting, sorry to interrupt, but I was kind of like hearing some of what you were talking about. I mean, obviously, one aspect of data portability or kind of, being able to move data in different ways would be to allow startups to compete with existing firms. But one also then is you have a hard time building your own business model on proprietary data. Like, where would you come down on that trade-off? Like, is it worth giving up proprietary access to the data you're collecting and generating in order to get access to someone else's, and either your business or different types of businesses and things like that.
It is, but I think when you think about specifically AI, a lot of the innovation happened here because people were sharing algorithms and sort of the how-tos because they knew that they owned the data, and so they felt very, very secure in saying, hey, here's my stuff, go ahead, grab it, do what you want with it, haha, we've got way more data than you do. And that gave a lot of startups an entry and an opportunity, and I think that shouldn't be lost on us. There's a trade-off there, but that worked pretty well.
I mean, certainly I would expect if you were to put in some significant data portability regulations, this would probably dramatically affect the valuations of a number of companies out there, right? Positively and negatively, right? And depending, in different cases.
Without question, but I think it would also reduce the amount of sharing that happened within the academic and frankly commercial world.
Right. I would agree. Yeah.
I would just note that I would draw a line between voluntary and mandatory data sharing. And on the voluntary side, so-called open data initiatives, there's a lot going on that will foster innovation in a lot of these spaces, like facial recognition, voice recognition, things like that. Cancer research is another classic example. Institutes, businesses have very valuable data sets, and they don't want to give those data sets up. They spent a fortune getting them, or they're good data. They wouldn't mind sharing them as long as they don't have to give up ownership. And what we've just put out as Microsoft into the marketplace recently is a set of 3 open source licenses that address varying degrees of privacy issues and also ownership. I am not an intellectual property licensing attorney, so I won't go into the details of them. But basically, these are licenses that are allowed to let people who want to share their data with somebody else to share it on a basis that is either GDPR compliant and maintains their proprietary ownership over that data. I think the real issue for regulation is first of all, regulations that foster such sharing would be great. But on the flip side, in the US, for example, we have law that basically says I don't have to share my data with you. We have the so-called Trinco case going all the way back to Colgate. I don't have a duty to deal with my competitors. Now, it's different in Europe. We don't have an essential facilities doctrine in the US either. We have a very narrow set of cases based on so-called detrimental reliance. But in Europe, it's much more open field, and there is more room for mandatory data sharing.
So something that I've heard, so JP and Chaim brought up startups that are already existing and how they might be hurt by some of these new regulations, and we're hearing about some differences across the U.S. and Europe. One of the things that I've heard from talking with different startups that are based here in the U.S. is they of course hope someday to be big and perhaps do business in Europe. And so even though they're not bound by GDPR in any way, shape, or form, because they don't have any clients in Europe, they don't do business with anybody in Europe, they hope to it someday. And so they're already treating GDPR as a de facto standard. And so then that sort of begs the question. I mean, so while we might not have laws like GDPR here in the U.S., although we'll see what happens in California, I guess. I guess I'd be curious to hear from you guys. I mean, has GDPR already become a standard of sorts?
I wouldn't say for small startups, understanding all the details of GDPR would be expensive if you're sitting here in the U.S. and trying to sell to the U.S. market. But we definitely talk about it a lot, and certainly from what we know and what we're able to sort of learn from others, we're constantly thinking about it. We're always thinking about how to grow into our next market, and Europe tends to be that next market for most of us. Again, specifically to our use case, GDPR may in some cases not be feasible. So we have a product that we sell throughout the U.S., but we don't sell it in Illinois because the Illinois Biometric Privacy Act makes it impossible to sell. So we do make trade-offs about where we do and where we don't do certain things. Obviously, we want to figure out how to navigate in Europe, but I think specific to biometric data, I think the first case went in front of a council, I forgot which one of the Nordic countries, if I'm not mistaken, on facial recognition, and it didn't go that well, at least not for the folks who were using it. So I think we're all kind of waiting to see what that looks like, and I guess how regulators look at the use of these products and define acceptable use or not.
We are GDPR compliant worldwide, as I would imagine just about every large business in the country is at this point. So it is the de facto standard. If you're selling to somebody who might happen to be in Europe, you're selling under GDPR, and it basically carving your business up and saying, I'll do this here and do this there, you can't manage it that way. And we have been fully GDPR compliant throughout our entire company now since before it actually became effective.
I'm actually curious, since we are on data regulation and GDPR, like Marshall Van Alstyne in his talk came strongly against it, if you were here, which is an interesting stance for an academic to take, because we tend to be more for regulation as academics sometimes. So what's your take in terms of that particular regulation and sort of how it affected what you do beyond compliance? Like, does it make sense? Is it helping address the problems that were discussed?
This is one of the great problems of this space from a regulatory perspective, and whoever solves it should either get a Nobel Prize or make a lot of money. I don't know. I would call it the antitrust privacy paradox, which would be, on the one hand, the remedy to improve innovation across a wide spectrum of especially in heavily aggregated markets where barriers to entry are high, is to make that data available to competitors in some way so that they can actually compete. And these are scale businesses. Not only are they scale businesses, they're dynamic scale businesses, which means I need not just the data today, I need more than what I've got today, tomorrow, to be improving to keep up with my competition. And so data sharing schemes that would basically be of the most value to competitors in these markets may involve data that is in fact covered under GDPR and can't be shared. And so it has the effect, when it comes to those data, if there were to be a data sharing scheme, you'd have to resolve that conflict with the GDPR. And so what it really does is it has, as Marshall said this morning, it does have the effect of entrenching the market position of the dominant players, because they can just say, well, I'd love to help you, but I can't give you that data under GDPR.
Well, and even beyond that, just generally speaking, we understand typically that regulation favors large incumbents who can afford to become entirely compliant before they have to, as opposed to saying there's no way I could even understand it, let alone implement it in some of these, fully understand it in some of these cases. And so it almost feels like if you're going to put in place some sort of a significant regulation, it has to overcompensate for providing benefits for smaller companies. Otherwise, it's going to produce the effect of entrenching and maintaining status quo pretty strongly. 9 times out of 10. This is like, you look at the big banks, they're the biggest proponents of regulation at this point in time. Why? To kill off competition. There's just, it's a good business practice.
I disagree.
Okay.
I've been curious when I'd start disagreeing with Professor Eggers here. Yeah, so you can design regulation in such a way that it's perhaps tiered, right? Where you have some form of regulation for, banks are a great example. So Dodd-Frank has one set of rules for really large banks and a different set of rules for smaller banks that are below a threshold. With banks, it's easy to create that threshold because it's, in principle,
Someone
you look
still
at
has
assets.
to pick the lines, right?
That's right. You look at assets. In the case of tech, it's less clear. Is it sort of lines of code? Is it number of
Daily
retail
users.
customers? Is it something about like amount of data? That part is not clear. But in principle, I imagine you could create tiers, sort of regulatory tiers. And in fact, I believe for GDPR that's the case. Although it's like a really small cutoff. I think it's below $1 million, and you're exempt from GDPR. But that's such a small amount that maybe that sort of doesn't matter. But you could imagine with, just for example, taking data portability, maybe it applies to companies of a certain size. Maybe it gets phased in where it's initially companies of a certain size are subject to it, and then later on it gets rolled out to other companies. As a side note, when telephone number portability was put in place, it did in fact have this sort of staggered introduction where the larger companies had to put it in place first, so sort of the different kinks could be ironed out before the smaller companies had to put it in place. So you could have something sort of similar. with data portability.
Not to end up agreeing with you, but I mean, to some extent, this is what I would say around kind of needing to favor the smaller companies in a pretty exaggerated way, right? It has to provide, whether it be by giving them better benefits or exempting them from the regulations, but you've got to be very careful not even to view it as a level playing field, because the instant you're putting in regulation, you're kind of de-leveling the playing field. And so you're going to have to make that overcompensation in some way, shape, or form. I do think the political process of how you set those tiers, what those numbers look like, and how you measure it would be such a mess in a more difficult to measure space that I'm not sure what would come out of it, but at least you could make an attempt down that path, I would say. I'd agree on that side.
Well, do you want to weigh in?
I don't have a lot more to add. Certainly JP took my side over here. No, thank you. I don't know if I could have said it as eloquently, but certainly, when we look at regulation in the space, we, in concept, we welcome it. We think it solves problems, but it does create additional overhead. But when you're starting a company, you kind of know you're going to walk into some of these things. So, overall, I would say, I don't think it bothers me tremendously. I think it's another hurdle.
Just before we move on to the next topic, something you said earlier is kind of in my head,
Okay.
because you have a very specific example here with Illinois and perhaps soon with California, where are we supposed to interpret Illinois' law on the use of bioinformatics data as a deterrent to innovation, because an innovative company like yours basically is not entering this market, as putting all companies competing with you on the same level field, which is sort of what we heard, like law does that for us. Sort of what should be our take? Because it is a states, runs these experiments, it creates these laws, and we can learn by comparing. At least my esteemed colleagues who are economists have learned by comparing what happens. I know HIPAA introductions that took place over time actually created a laboratory for economists and data scientists interested in all sorts of issues. And so in some sense, we have this now with this other privacy regulation. But I'm just curious, sort of, I feel like the position of a larger company is more clear to me. When you have all these trade-offs in terms of looking at this regulation. So can you walk us through a little bit, like if you versus state of Illinois?
So, I mean, Greg probably knows more about the Illinois Privacy Act than I do, and if he does, no? Okay, so I apologize. So it's an old law, and I think the consensus was that it was passed before we really understood where we'd be using biometrics. And so if I'm not mistaken, I believe it was Kroger's was the first company, or first large story to get sued for using fingerprint scanners for timestamping. And it certainly wasn't the intent of the law to go after that. I mean, I can't imagine anybody really thought that that was the right thing. Now, what's so onerous about the Illinois Privacy Act is that it actually requires consent, written consent, before you capture somebody. If I'm not mistaken, there was a news article just this week about some of the larger tech companies getting sued under the Illinois Biometric Privacy Act. About a year and a half ago, we kept hearing about how the Illinois legislature was looking to sort of rewrite this or modernize it. I think state of Washington's Biometric Privacy Act is considered the gold standard for folks in MySpace these days. And I don't know, I would say that in the last 6 months, we've seen a really, really surprising new focus on privacy and a very different agenda, certainly here in New York, but I'd say throughout the country. And I don't know that there's in this environment, I don't know that Illinois is actually going to ever do anything to change what they have. In terms of HIPAA is something that we do look at. We are in the hospital and elder care space, and it it's a space we actually do pay attention to. And but going back to the question you asked me, do I feel like Illinois is I have a battle with Illinois? Absolutely not. Do I feel like I'm likely to get scrutinized faster than another company working in Illinois? Absolutely not. So when we spoke to our attorneys, we made a decision just not to comply in Illinois and not to sell in Illinois. They pointed out that, technically speaking, that doesn't mean Illinois can't go after you in certain circumstances. The decision that we made was, gee, we're too small at this point to even consider what that would mean, I would imagine that Microsoft would say, oh my God, that's a real problem. So in the specific use case you asked me, I would say the larger companies have a bigger problem than I do. I can stay away and nobody knows who I am.
Would you have a reaction to my question?
Well, no, because I'm not a privacy lawyer and I don't advise the company on privacy matters. I do think, though, that the piecemeal regulation does affect competitiveness, and I think a unified standard, a national privacy law, something like a GDPR for the U.S. makes a lot more sense than 50 states' privacy laws. And for business, especially large businesses, it's almost an imperative at this point, for the very reason you cite. You've got Illinois over here. How do we not sell in Illinois?
So it seems to me like there is some consensus on that some regulation would be good, that nobody seems to argue with. Before we are running a bit short, but so I would like to maybe just ask everybody to weigh in on this question of self-regulation. You mentioned it. I'm actually wondering if we could start with you. Just give us an example of like how you did this self-regulation and where was the boundaries, and maybe everybody can weigh in on this question.
It's going to be a very specific answer, and hopefully it doesn't. Okay. So one of the products we ended up selling was a rent fraud tool. So large companies could use our service to figure out whether people were subletting apartments illegally. It's a hot topic in New York and all over the country. We sort of sold ourselves as the company that was here to service the folks who want to do it right. I actually got into the space because I cared about the intersection of transparency and AI. So one of the rules we had was you have to have a separate fraud department. We would never allow you to look at the data if you actually had access to the building. So if you were a really large real estate company, you could say, well, we have a fraud department, and all they do is look at tons of data on people coming in and out of a building and saying, hey, these are the people who belong here, these are the people who don't belong here. And the idea is they're disassociated from the space. They don't know anything about the people. There were several other things as well to sort of ensure that there was what we refer to as a firewall between the folks who were assessing the data and the folks who actually were on the ground. We did sell to some of the larger real estate companies, and we stayed away from anybody who couldn't comply, and we were very proud about that sort of self-regulation, us saying, hey, we won't do this. We would walk into, we had some other AI products that we looked for odd behaviors in buildings, and if we walked into a property and we saw the property owner kind of didn't understand that he had a responsibility to protect, I like to refer to it as, as a property owner, you're a custodian of people's private information. You have a lot of information about people coming in and going, when they go to the hospital, when something bad happens in their family, and it's your job to sort of keep that quiet. And if you can't do that, we don't want to sell to you. So that was an example of self-regulation we would proudly write on our website. We don't share your data. We need to have these things. If you can't comply, we won't sell to you. Ideally, there's regulation that says, hey, this is the data. Tell us exactly who you share your data with. Tell us where it's stored. Tell us how it's stored. Tell us what the governance rules are for accessing that data, and ensure that you can't just willy-nilly go and look at pictures of people walking in and out of buildings, because that's not cool. That would be the example.
I'm just asking everybody to weigh in
okay.
on
Wasn't sure what order you wanted to go in. So I guess I would mostly say that, and this is maybe a great example of this, I think, and a lot of this builds off of actually Annabelle's comments about where and why many platforms fail, and kind of what are the reasons why that would happen in these cases. I think when a lot of these companies are small, and especially when they're featuring that they're thinking about a winner-take-all kind of a market, or winner-take-most kind of an environment, they're very much focused on growth, and at that point in time, the incentive alignment between kind of social welfare and the platform tends to be pretty strong. Yes, there are exceptions, but for the most part, the platform's going to have the best chance of growth by offering the best value to customers, and that's what's really going to drive growth at that point in time. The concern I would mostly have is that at some point in time, the lock-in effect of network effects and the scale and the size leads to kind of a push for growth through other avenues that starts where the incentives start to diverge at that point in time. And that's, I think, where we run into challenges where it becomes no longer about, hey, how do I keep people happy and grow fast? And I've got this big installed base. I'm not growing really all that fast. What are ways that I can kind of churn more money out of the people that I already have? That's where you start seeing Facebook starting to do all kinds of crazy stuff with the data. You start seeing Amazon proliferating hundreds of different product categories to compete with their own products online. And this is where we run into problems. So I think it's really understanding, and actually Ji-Hoon was talking about it too, this kind of the life cycle and evolution of these platforms. And there are different moments when when self-regulation will play okay, often when they're smaller. But at some point it becomes more challenging.
Interesting. Yes.
So JP's, Professor Egger's comments are interesting. Just in terms of thinking about the life cycle of a company and when self-regulation might work better versus not. So I think that's thought-provoking. In general, I sort of view them as separate. I can't envision a world where one would rely entirely on self-regulation. There absolutely needs to be some type of government regulation. And then I guess the question is, well, when does self-regulation work well versus not? And JP, I think I would agree with your thoughts there. There certainly are great examples of large companies, for example, large platforms, that have sort of successfully done some self-regulation. One example that I tend to think of is, or that I like to think about, is Airbnb. Was accused at one point. This is not sort of legally accused, but apparently had been, some of the hosts were discriminating against some of the guests, and so Airbnb sort of created its own solution to this. I think it's a great example of a company, or a platform in this case, engaging in some self-regulation, but I don't think that we can entirely rely on that. I think that for sure there's a role for government regulation.
When I think of self-regulation, I guess what I'm really thinking of is industry self-regulation, which in some of these areas is helpful and useful and good. AI being one of those spaces. Content moderation. We recently kicked off a process with the Prime Minister of New Zealand at the helm of it after the Christchurch massacre, called the Christchurch Call, and it's basically companies joining together to brainstorm ways to regulate terrorist and violent content on the web. That's great. That type of collaboration and self-regulation and discussion is going to be the root for, hopefully, what later may be required is government regulations that actually say, okay, here's how we're going to do it. So I think there's a real role for what I call self-regulation. As a complete solution, I don't think it has a track record of working that well, because economic incentives being what they are, people are going to have the incentive to deviate, and that's just a fact of human nature sometimes. So there will be regulations maybe layered on top of some of these things.
Actually, so only a handful of people have used our new technology platform. It's just an adoption study.
Slow adoption, right?
Slow adoption.
Yeah.
And I'm reading through the comments, and actually, for what I see is two questions that I'm going to reformulate. Forgive me if you asked that. I'm not going to read it word for word. And several of the questions are on this sort of topic. And again, it's easy now. I can say the audience is asking you, because it's going to be a tough one. And then the question is, we're hearing basically technology companies, small and large, kind of embracing regulation in this public forum and other places as well, not just here at Stern. And the question is, are you really accepting change, or the change is being pushed on technology companies rapidly by government bodies? And this is sort of positioning, and it's not just you, of course, Facebook and others are testifying and influencing. And sort of, is it more of a strategy to say, if it's going to happen anyway, we might as well influence it in certain ways? So I think what I'm reading behind this question is, look, how real is your belief in the value of regulation? Thanks for asking. Versus sort of, just needing to be in the right position to shape the regulation.
Yeah, do you mind if I go first?
Absolutely.
Okay, great. So, as a small company, it's kind of harder to separate me, the individual I am, from the company. And so I can tell you as a person, an individual who does not have any Echo, Amazon Alexa devices on in my home, I care very much about privacy and transparency. I care very much about the protection of my data. I have interesting views on, or perhaps different views on what privacy means. But it's something that's very close to my heart. So I actually want to see regulation as an individual. When it comes to my company, I think it translates the same way. We do think that regulation is necessary. And again, we don't want to see a ton of regulation. We want to see regulation that's sort of, frankly, a code of ethics, if you will, right? That says, hey, this is acceptable, this is not. Because that levels the playing field and we're not competing with folks who have no scruples and morals. I guess that's what it's about for us. So yes, it's important to us individually and it's important to us as a company. It's not just a strategy.
I agree with that. I think where regulation really becomes critical is in these areas that are really more of a social, economic, industrial structure, public policy arena, as opposed to the rules of the road for competition in a market. And I draw a line there. And I'm not saying that there should be no regulation in markets for competition, but there's a real desire at the tech companies to have a clear picture of what the rules of the road are on things like privacy and content moderation and data sharing and these types of things. And all of that is good because it creates certainty and you know the bounds in which you are going to be innovating. On the competition side, I think it's easy to say, yeah, I agree, and then do nothing about it. Mm-hmm. Voluntary data, for instance, voluntary data portability. I think most people agree that platforms should have data portability, but I don't think there's a lot of detailed thinking going into what kind of data. And is that data actually competitively significant in this market? And there are going to be cases where the data that is competitively significant for a market is not the kind of data that companies are going to be willing to share voluntarily. And that's where I think the rubber is going to meet the road on whether we need regulations or whether we think we don't. And I see people and companies kind of dividing along these two lines, subject to the privacy issue getting worked out as well.
Thanks. I just wanted, unfortunately, we don't have time for in-depth Q&A. I did want to mention that at Stern, beyond people here, we also have Center for Human Rights and Progress, and just want to shout out to Paul Barrett, who together with Mike Posner has authored a report on what they believe from the human rights perspective is a way of putting some responsibility, especially around content. So really kind of speaking to your point and to what my colleagues have written, where some sort of responsibility, if not regulation, has to fall on the shoulders of content providers. With that, any closing thoughts, especially from academics? I'm curious if your position has changed or if you were influenced in any way by this discussion before we move on. Rob?
I'll make one comment. So the focus, of course, has been on tech and on platforms because that's the nature of the discussion. But I would point out that some of the topics that we've been talking about in this panel, like privacy and data, are not tech specific. And for that matter, sort of, some of the regulatory solutions, such as data portability, that this can apply to banks, this can apply to healthcare firms, privacy, of course, data, all of these same things apply. And so I think that this is part of a sort of a broader conversation that we're sort of having, obviously, as a country and a society.
I would, honestly, I really felt like Greg's comments really kind of nailed a lot of the stuff that I was thinking about. I think people, for the most part, want to see some degree of consistency, clarity, kind of establish kind of what the rules of the road are and kind of let people kind of figure out around that. At the same time, we're going to get it wrong out of the gate. It's almost impossible to get it right. We're going to have to figure out how to adjust over time. And even if we got it right on day one, by day 3, it's going to be outdated. And this is going to be one of the real challenges. Is kind of how are we, if we are going to put in place regulation, even if we all agree right now, what's the mechanism to help it evolve? Because that's really what's likely to become problematic. I mean, the Illinois example is a great one where it's kind of, maybe it was a good idea at the time, but it's not that time anymore. And so I think we're going to have to spend a lot of time and effort, not just on figuring out what and how we regulate it, but how will that have to change in order to be effective for more than a few weeks at that point in time.
I'm just curious, so I'm going to use my 1 minute as a moderator here to actually ask people, for people in the tech healthcare space, not as consumers but as producers, how many of you think that HIPAA is a good regulation? I see 0 hands from my standpoint. So.
You don't know what the
Find out how many people are in
denominator is.
that
Well, right.
space.
Well, I know because I put the conference together. When was HIPAA, now I can ask a question to somebody who knows most of it, but when was HIPAA put into place? That any of the lawyers in the room remember, but it's at least 10 years old from my memory, if not more. And how often is HIPAA updated? So I just want to close by saying we have these great ideas, and I think I want to thank everybody. I think our ideas are better than their implementations in practice. Because from what you guys said, and I have just learned a lot, we need super smart, up-to-date digital regulators who would understand not only the content presented today with the different types of platforms, different stages of businesses, the evolution of different platforms and different stages of businesses, and some first, second, and third order effects of regulation. And so one day I hope we will have those leaders, but I think we're putting a lot of asks. And so, I think we put a lot of good ideas out there, and I hope they read them and maybe read your reports, Paul, but sort of we're asking for a lot of thought where it may be more, and hopefully I wonder if both academics and practitioners should be involved in shaping these regulations, because it's hard to get even for us, and for somebody whose daily job is not technology and technology business would be even harder. So, but with that, I would like to thank you all for coming here and for having this provocative conversation. Thanks.